Hello, welcome this evening. My name is Andrew Copson. I'm the Chief Executive of Humanists UK. We're here to celebrate Darwin Day. This is the 16th Humanists UK Darwin Day Lecture. We started in 2013, and it's set, of course, to be the best ever. I don't think there are any of the previous speakers in the audience. If there are, the best but one, you know. We're very pleased this year to have Jim Al-Khalili, our former president and current vice president, chairing. And the speaker, of course, is Diana Fleischman, of whom more shortly. More than 7,000 people have attended our Darwin Day lectures in the last 5 years. I'm not just reading this for fun, it's a fact that's meant to astonish you. We'll try again. More than 7,000 people have attended our Darwin Day lectures. They've reached tens of thousands of people online. There you go. Yeah. With last year's lecture alone having been seen by more than 80,000 people online. There's no need to. Don't come out. It's a diminishing return, I know. Okay. It's part of our events program through the year, so part of my responsibility here is to advertise to you the forthcoming highlights. The next event in our annual lecture series is the Rosalind Franklin Lecture, which will be given by science journalist Angela Sarni with a talk entitled Under Wraps, the Policing of Female Sexuality. That'll take place on the 7th of March. It will shortly be sold out. All our lectures are always sold out, so please get your tickets as soon as possible. And, of course, our annual convention is in Newcastle on the 22nd to 24th of June, and tickets there for that are also available on the Humanists UK website. If you are not yet a member of Humanists UK through some horrible oversight, and I do know who you are, please do feel free to rectify this oversight at your leisure. But for this evening, enjoy the lecture, and please give a warm welcome to the chair of that lecture, Jim Al-Khalili.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have my Darwin Day socks, by the way. Hope you all approve. They're not, they're just socks that I thought I'd wear. So, I thought, by way of introducing our speaker this evening, I thought I'd say a few words. I'm pretty sure they're not going to be controversial among this audience. Last year, late last year, I think it was early December, the Archbishop of Canterbury was speaking at a House of Lords debate on education, in which he argued that our secular education system prepares children for a career or to earn money, but doesn't teach them how to become effective members of society. He said, I quote, "We have a world of unguided and competing narratives where the only common factor is the inviolability of personal choice, which means that for schools that are not of a religious character, confidence in any personal sense of ultimate values has diminished." This notion that moral values, ethical behavior, somehow the preserve of those with a religious faith, or at least somehow stronger in those who get their moral code from a holy book, is one of the weakest arguments against secularists and humanists. So it is with great anticipation that I, and I'm sure all of you, are looking forward to this year's Darwin Lecture on the evolution of human morality. Our speaker is a senior lecturer in evolutionary psychology at the University of Portsmouth, where she's been for the last 6 years. Diana Fleischman and I just met this evening for the first time, despite, it turns out, living within 2 minutes' walk of each other down in Portsmouth. So you live just behind near Waitrose. I'm just round the corner. So, Portsmouth is not that big, you know, so I'm not quite sure how that's happened, that our paths haven't crossed. Diana carried out her PhD work at the University of Texas at Austin, on the hormonal influences on the psychology of disease avoidance and disgust. She's conducted research on a wide range of topics, and her current interests focus on 2 broad themes, if your website is still up to date. Hormonal influences on the behavior of women, and how humans adaptively avoid cues of contagion, including how our disgust is regulated. Diana's also, I found this interesting, on the board at Sentient Institute, a new think tank devoted to expanding humanity's moral circle to animals. As an effective altruist, Diana's committed to reducing the suffering of non-human animals by promoting research into effective interventions through animal charity evaluators, engaging with the public, through writing her blogs, podcasts, interviews, and, of course, conducting serious psychological research into human attitudes towards animals. In this evening's lecture, she'll explore how our evolved morality can cope with the ethical landscape of modern society and whether we'll allow ourselves moral enhancement. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this year's Darwin lecturer, Dr. Diana Fleischman.
Good evening, everyone. So, Andrew said that everyone loves a deconversion story, so I'll tell you mine in a moment. My name is Diana Fleischman. I'm at the University of Portsmouth. I'm also a member of Sentience Institute, and I'm going to be talking today about the evolution of human morality. I became an atheist, I became secular fully when I was about 20 years old, not very far from here at the LSE. I was doing a year abroad at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And at that time, I was taking a course called The Psychoanalytic Study of Society by a guy named Christopher Badcock. And he was interested in talking about how religions are very similar in content to some paranoid delusions. So he talks about a patient of Freud's called Schreber. And Schreber thought that God was going to turn him into a woman and impregnate him with a new race of human beings. And Schreber thought he was constantly being watched. And this idea about being impregnated by the sun or by some kind of god is very common in various different religious mythologies. And he talked about the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. So this is the Virgin Mary, and this is the Annunciation. And during the Annunciation, when the angels speak to her and they tell her that she's going to give birth to Jesus, she becomes impregnated. However, given that it's a Christian myth, she can't become impregnated through her sexual organs. That would be improper. So she is impregnated instead through her ears. And according to Christians, the Virgin Mary was impregnated through her ears. And if you want to ask Christians, was it the right ear or the left ear that the Virgin Mary was impregnated through? It was both ears simultaneously that she conceived Jesus through. So on to the topic of today's talk. I am an evolutionary psychologist, and evolutionary psychology essentially thinks about the human mind similar to the way that one might think about the human body. So the human body has got various adaptations. The kidneys, the livers, they detoxify the blood. Your digestive system, which extracts nutrients from your food. But your mind also has adaptations. And your mind has adaptations that solve particular problems throughout our evolutionary history. I'm going to be talking a lot about disgust today, and disgust solved this problem of avoiding potentially contaminated food, for example, or avoiding disease. And the mind has these adaptations: jealousy, anger, lust, disgust, all these different kinds of adaptations that solved certain kinds of problems throughout our evolutionary history. Now, today I'm going to be talking about two different kinds of moral evolution as I'm talking about evolution. The way that our morality evolved, that is the emotions and thought patterns that shape our moral instincts and get our genes into the next generation, and also how evolution endowed us with pleasure, intellect, understanding, a feeling of self. But evolution doesn't care if we're happy. Evolution doesn't really care if we're ethical. So the other kind of moral evolution I'm going to be talking about is how I see our moral evolution moving forward, actually transhumanist morality, overcoming our human instincts and becoming more moral through a variety of means, not that we haven't already. So let's go over some of the fundamental building blocks of human morality. And evolution is a totally amoral process, but it does produce some of the building blocks of morality that we have really leveraged to great effect in human society. So the first building block that I'm going to be talking about is kin selection, and these are honeybees. And why are eusocial insects so cooperative? Why do they take care of one another? In a honeybee colony, why do the female worker bees, they groom the queen, they look after each other, they'll sting anyone who comes around and threatens the hive? And among honeybees, the workers are all female, and they're all related by about 75%. If the queen is monogamous, they're all related by about 75%. And because of this, they have a vested interest in the queen producing more sisters and more workers, and they have an interest in the hive. So that's called inclusive fitness. Basically, J.B.S. Haldane was asked, would you drown, would you jump in a lake to save your brother? And he said, I would jump in a lake to save 2 brothers or 6 cousins, right? The idea here is that it's not just the genes that you carry yourself, but also the genes in other people. And Dawkins talked a lot about this in The Selfish Gene. If I help my brother have 2 children, more than he could have without my help, then in essence, it's as good as me having a child. And cooperation is really bound up with kin selection to a great extent. So Lisa De Bruyne, who's a face researcher up in Scotland, she did really interesting studies where she morphs faces and she alters cues of kinship. So we tend to cooperate more with people who look like us than people who do not look like us. And she did this morph where she has this face in the middle, and she averaged these 2 faces, and she made a face that looks like more like this target face, and she makes a face that looks much less like even like this target face. So she subtracts the average, and then she adds the average together. And there are a variety of experiments done like this, where you are playing a particular game. These are called economic games, and you have to decide how much you're going to endow the other people that you're playing with. How much are you going to give them, or how much are you going to trust them in a certain game? Let's say in the game they can potentially defect on you. And in a variety of different studies, they found that if you have people who you're playing with who look more similar to you, who exhibit these kinds of kinship cues, you're more cooperative, you exhibit more trust. And also, if you think someone else is trustworthy, you're more likely to think that they look physically similar to you than people who are untrustworthy. And Charles Darwin talked about this in the form of nationalism. Charles Darwin talked about a tribe including many members who, from possessing in high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. This is quite a controversial idea about group selection, but it is true that culture leverages kin selection in order to get people to cooperate more. In terms of kin selection, we use these kinds of ideas like brothers in arms. If you look at the military, part of the reason why everyone dresses alike and has the same haircut is so that they exhibit these cues of kinship. Part of the reason that they're in America, you're not allowed to grow a beard, so that everybody has these kinds of cues of kinship that they're not easy to hide. So another building block of moral psychology and evolved morality is something called reciprocal altruism. And I'm going to give you absolutely the cutest example ever. These are vampire bats. And vampire bats, if they don't eat for 70 hours, they die. And what do vampire bats eat? Obviously, they eat blood. And so what they do is they do food sharing. So if one vampire bat gets a lot to eat, and they generally don't feed every night, they generally don't find a blood meal every night, what one vampire bat will do is regurgitate in the mouth of the other vampire bat. Isn't that sweet? And that way they can share with one another. And there's mixed reviews about this. Some say the bats are cousins, which would be an example of kin selection. But what happens also is one study showed that a bat is more likely to regurgitate or offer to another bat who has fed them in the past. And in that way, they exchange this type of thing. So one reason that we're nice is because we expect something in return. And we evolved in these small-scale societies. In a one-shot game, in a game in which you want something from me and I want something from you, and we are trying to make an exchange, it always makes sense if I'm not going to see you again for me to defect, for me to cheat you as much as possible. But because we evolved in these societies in which we did have iterated and repeated interactions, and also in which it was easy for us to gossip about one another and how moral each of us are, in those kinds of interactions, it was important not to cheat and not to defect if you were going to get any kind of good moral reputation that was going to increase your status and thereby increase your reproductive success. Among hunter-gatherers, they can't always rely on getting a kill all the time, and in many hunter-gatherers, what happens is if they get a kill, they will share with everyone in the group, and then when they're less lucky another day, they also share a kill, which is actually quite similar to the vampire bats. A third way, other than natural selection, that you see morality evolve is through sexual selection. And this is a peacock spider, much more exciting than the usual sexual selection totem, which is the peacock itself. And this peacock spider, he not only has this beautifully colored flap, he wiggles it around, he takes his arms and he goes up and down, and he shows the female how coordinated he is, how symmetrical he is, what kind of rhythm he has, and the female assesses him for mating. And in this species, they're very small. She doesn't usually eat him if he fails, although that does happen in many other spider species. And in humans, there is also sexual selection for moral virtues. Physically and romantically attractive mental traits have a moral dimension. If you think about the kinds of things that people do for each other romantically in the first stages of courtship, these also have a moral dimension. If someone is generous to you, if someone is willing to sacrifice their well-being for your well-being, these are things that we also think of as moral. So there are sexual selection for moral virtues, and even Darwin suggested this. And Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and in part, he admired her virtue. And in women and men, there's certain things that they are more likely to select in a mate. Women are more likely to select males who engage in risky, heroic behavior, but not just risky behavior. If somebody says that they ran into a burning building to rescue a baby, then that's going to be more impressive than saying that they can do sick skateboarding tricks in the park, right? So people who appreciate risky behavior in terms of heroism, and also if you ask people to assess mates and look at mates in the kind of artificial context of looking at kind of single ads, you'll also see this interaction where if somebody says that they spent money on a new watch or whether they gave it to charity, people are more likely to say that they prefer a mate who gives money to charity than one who spends money on themselves. There are different moral emotions that we use in order to create moral behavior. And these moral emotions have a lot more power than rationality does. So there are moral emotions that we feel ourselves, and then there are moral emotions that we use to condition others. So if someone else engages in a bad behavior, for example, you might feel angry with them or disgusted against them. Anger is usually associated with somebody transgressing against you directly, whereas disgust is more likely to arise when someone transgresses against someone else, especially if that person is weak or unable to fend for themselves. If somebody is to cheat somebody who's elderly or a child, that's much worse and more disgust-worthy otherwise. There's also other praising kinds of moral emotions. If we express gratitude at somebody, then that's our way of reinforcing them for whatever moral behavior. Awe is another way of eliciting better moral behavior out of somebody else. We also feel other people's suffering. There's empathy and there's compassion. So empathy can be feeling somebody else's pain. Compassion can be anticipating how someone else is going to feel. And then there's also self-conscious emotions like guilt and shame, which can prevent us from transgressing against the moral rules of whatever group that we belong to. And these are examples of, I think dogs actually make better guilt faces than people ever do, even though it's unclear if they experience guilt. Certainly they're very good at making you think that they feel guilty so that they don't get punished. Jonathan Haidt calls these moral emotions the elephant and the rider. And the elephant and the rider is a simple metaphor that essentially says what you have in your mind, you think that you are actually governing the elephant's behavior, you think that you're controlling things, but your emotions are actually really driving you. And if you look at people who make moral decisions, what they generally do is they feel the emotion first, and then they rationalize how they think it's morally immoral later. So this elephant and the rider metaphor is really important to think about why evolved morality generally is less rational than it could be. And there's a lot of other psychological constructs that talk about this. There's like system 1 and system 2, which is Daniel Kahneman. People talk about this kind of fast and slow. Joshua Green talks about the manual settings of your moral camera, or the automatic settings, right? The things that you feel automatically versus the moral ideas that you actually have to rationalize and think about more clearly. So one important moral emotion is disgust. And even though disgust evolved to present disease, it actually is leveraged for all kinds of other things. Disgust is the emotion that we feel when someone transgresses against a moral rule, especially if they transgress against a moral rule that has to do with hygiene or cooking or sex. And one interesting thing about disgust is that it takes a long time to come online. So this idea is that disgust, even though disgust is a very old emotion, like all emotions are, only adult humans actually have disgust. So if you look at non-human primates, I don't know if you've ever spent any time with non-human primates, but they generally don't experience disgust. Children don't actually call any kinds of item of food or anything like that disgusting until they're about 9 years old. If you give a child a complete replica of dog feces made of cheese and chocolate, they will essentially eat it very happily until about 3 years of age. And they know whether things are yucky or not yucky. They have that kind of idea about what's, but there's a sensitive period in which they decide what to eat. And if disgust came online too early, you actually wouldn't be able to learn how to eat what your particular group eats. There are many people who eat tripe, there are people who eat grubs, there are people who eat balut, which is duck embryo. There are all kinds of things that people eat, and if we weren't flexible enough in our disgust to learn how to eat various things. So you see this, that adults actually have this sort of crystallized disgust. And disgust is also very important for our moral reasoning. We find things disgusting that are evil. And there's a famous experiment done by Paul Rosen where he asked, would you wear Hitler's sweater? And they offered people, Hitler's jumper. They offered people some degree of money to wear what it was said to be Hitler's jumper, and they said that they had laundered it. They said that Mother Teresa had worn it later, and people were still unwilling to wear the jumper. I'm assuming these are people who didn't read Hitchens on Mother Teresa. They were like, I'm fine with wearing Hitler's sweater, but not Mother Teresa. So they were unwilling to do so, even though it had been thoroughly washed and it had been worn by somebody considered really good. So this is one example of how disgust actually governs things. There's another idea which is called moral dumbfounding, and this is something that Jonathan Haidt has come up with as well, which is an example of how we become frozen, our rationality becomes frozen, and we become unable to actually think about things rationally when we're strongly emoting. So a woman is cleaning out her closet and she finds an old British flag. She doesn't want the flag anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her toilet. Now, many of you who are probably fairly left-leaning are like, yeah, why not? Why not use your British flag to clean a toilet? But there are people who are more interested in purity and sanctity, which are these other moral domains. In the United States, there's a lot of conflict about what happens with the flag, and there's a lot of other moral thought experiments that Jonathan Haidt asks about. For example, he says, a family, their dog gets run over outside, and they bring the dog in, and they decide to make the dog for dinner. Nobody sees this. Is this wrong? Or two twins decide to have sex, two identical male twins. Why is that wrong? Or a man brings a chicken home every day from the supermarket and then decides to have sex with it before he eats it. I gave this thought experiment to my class, and I made the mistake of saying he cooks it afterwards, and they were very astute. There's a salmonella risk there. It's like, that's true. I should have thought about that. It's a rotisserie chicken. Is it wrong for somebody to collect old Nazi coins? And if you ask people what's wrong with this kind of, what is the harm of these various different transgressions, they can't tell you. They just keep saying that it's morally wrong. And that's because of this kind of elephant and rider. You can bring it back to this elephant and rider metaphor, whereas the disgust is really driving you. You feel disgust, and then you decide these things are wrong afterwards. It's very difficult for you to say, actually, if two male identical twins want to have sex with each other, why shouldn't they? Especially if they look as nice, sorry. So that's, that's totally aside. there shouldn't be anything wrong with it. There's no chance. And people really are quite unusual about this, especially, brother-sister incest. If those people produce offspring, they're actually around the same likelihood of producing children with birth defects as, if both parents are very old, are much older or have any kind of genetic defects. And yet people don't think it's appropriate to prevent those people from reproducing. So there's different attitudes about whether or not disgust should actually guide our moral judgments. And some people say disgust is a good guide to morality, and other people say it's not. So this is Leon Kass, and he was a public intellectual. He was a Bush-era advisor. And he says, in this age in which everything is held to be permissible, so long as it is freely done, and in which our bodies are regarded as mere instruments of our autonomous rational will, repugnance may be the only voice left that speaks up to defend the core of our humanity. Shallow are the souls that have forgotten how to shudder. I think this guy thinks alliteration is an argument. It's not really an argument. But what Leon Kass is trying to say here is that we should really trust disgust. Disgust is telling us that something is wrong. And for example, in this country, it's illegal to use sperm sorting unless there's some kind of medical reason. So this is a question that I ask my class. What happens with sperm sorting is you take the sperm, you put it through an ion channel, and it increases the chance of either having a boy or having a girl. So somebody can, without any kind of sex-selective abortion, previous to conceiving a child, decide that they would like to have a boy or like to have a girl. And for people who are worried about people choosing boys overwhelmingly, actually in the United States, 75% of people decide to choose girls to have rather than boys. And so what's wrong with this? I think people really have a problem with the meddling. And so in this country, it's illegal to do that, even though I'm sure that people have sex-selective abortion instead of that because it is illegal. And disgust governs our attitudes towards all kinds of different new technologies that actually might have really good moral benefits. So people are very, very funny about genetically modified organisms. They call them frankenfoods. There's all this kind of disgust marketing about these kinds of ideas. For example, you can use gene drive to actually get rid of mosquitoes. People are strange about genetically modifying any kind of organisms. Organ donation markets tend to save a lot of lives. If people are allowed to sell their organs, that seems to actually work much better in terms of saving lives. And nobody's against saving lives, but I actually think that what happens is we feel disgusted when we think about somebody selling their organs to another person, whether we think about that in terms of exploitation or if we're just disgusted by the idea of transplants. And drug legalization, in vitro meat, which I'll talk about more, or clean meat, which is meat that's actually grown in a laboratory or in a factory rather than coming off of an animal. It's novel and it's unusual and it's biological, and people often have a disgust reaction to any kind of novel biological stimuli. So disgust, I think, is actually preventing us from doing some things that could really be better off for humanity and could be really moral. And Martha Nussbaum and Paul Bloom talk about this as well. Martha Nussbaum says, does disgust then contain a wisdom that steers law in the right direction? Surely the moral progress of society can be measured by the degree to which it separates disgust from danger and indignation, basing laws and social rules on substantive harm rather than on symbolic relationship an object bears to our anxieties. What she's essentially saying there is, it doesn't really make sense to use anxiety and disgust as a guide as to what should be legal and illegal. What we should really think about is what are the actual dangers, what are the actual problems. And what happens all the time is you see disgust leveraged in various different campaigns to try to sway people's emotions, and it works very well for things like food. Vegetarian, as I've been involved in vegetarian activism for some time, in the United States, they try and leverage disgust to make people feel strange about eating animal products. They call eggs hen periods, or they talk about pus and milk, right? And I actually don't think it works very well because people just generally try to ignore it as much as possible and go back to eating those things. Paul Bloom, who's another researcher who I'm going to be talking more about as well, who is somebody who wrote a book called Against Empathy, which I think is quite a good book, and he also makes the same argument about how empathy has constraints on our moral behavior. He says the irrationality of disgust suggests it is unreliable as a source of moral insight. There may be good arguments against gay marriage, partial birth abortions, and human cloning, but the fact that some people find such acts to be disgusting should carry no weight. It's very difficult to separate those things. It's very difficult to think to yourself, okay, just because I'm disgusted by this doesn't actually mean that there's anything wrong with it. I actually have to come up with rational reasons why I think that there's something wrong. We should trust calculations about harm more than we should trust our gut instinct. And so what I'm saying here is that our mind shouldn't necessarily be trusted all the time. In Buddhism, you call that monkey mind when you're meditating, when your mind is running amok and thinking about what you're going to eat that day and who gossiped about whom and what shoes you're going to wear to this talk and et cetera, right? That's the monkey mind, that's chattering, right? And in Buddhism and in even secular mindfulness, there's this idea that you should be somewhat cynical about what is happening in your mind when you're trying to calm it. Our evolved morality has many pitfalls, and rather than celebrating what's known as common sense morality, I see that a lot. People saying, oh, it's just common sense that X, Y, Z should be done, that everybody knows that this is moral or that is moral. Instead, I think we should be skeptical of it. I think our emotions are not a good guide. So one way that you can get around thinking about things from a purely kind of emotional perspective is by looking at the sort of thought experiments. So this is the trolley problem. Everybody knows the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is where you have a choice of killing one person or killing 5 people. It's a well-known kind of utilitarian thought experiment. And what happens is there's a few different iterations of it. So in the top iteration, you are on a drawbridge or on a bridge, and there's this train coming, and you can stop the train by pushing a man onto the tracks. And now it's become a little more politically correct. It used to be a fat man. Now it's a man with a large backpack. Any way you want to look at it, this guy is going to stop the train. So would you push the guy in order to stop the train? And our moral intuition is, oh, it's wrong to kill. It's wrong. But you realize that if you do nothing, 5 people are going to die instead. And generally we think that more death is worse than less death. If I told you that I was going to either kick you in the shin or shoot you in the foot, then you would say, I'd rather be kicked in the shin because that's less pain and suffering than being shot in the foot. The other kind of trolley problem is either that you can flip a switch or flip a button. Sometimes there's a few iterations where you can either kill one person or kill 5 people. And people are much more comfortable with flipping a switch rather than pushing someone off of a bridge. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is because of the intuition. You have this intuition that killing someone is wrong. But flipping a switch, even though you are killing somebody, doesn't seem quite as wrong. But another reason is, think about our ancestral history. If you did something immoral and somebody saw you, then you would have this reputation, and it would hurt you in the long run. So pushing a man off a bridge is a lot less, it's much more difficult to distance yourself from that act than it is to flip a switch, for example. So I think part of our intuitions about morality also come from not wanting to seem like psychopaths to other people. Another thought experiment that's really useful is what most people call Rawls's veil of ignorance, but I have just recently learned the first person to come up with it was Hashani. And I think that there's a reason why Rawls gets credit for it, because Rawlsian is much easier to say than Hashanian, veil of ignorance. But anyway, Hashani is this economist, maybe that's another reason why this hasn't gotten out as much as you could, who came up with this idea of the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is, if morality is about being impartial, assume that you don't know who you were going to be in a society. You had an equal chance of being anybody. How would you structure society? You would try to maximize the welfare of everyone because you could be anyone. So if it's a random lottery as to who you end up being in the society, you want to do whatever you can to improve the welfare of everyone, rather than structuring society in a way that has, you actually can have vast inequality and have people absolutely better off as well. But you would want to structure society in such a way that everyone has as much quality as they possibly can. And what that does is it leverages your self-interest to think about how you would help others. And that's also kind of a form of kin selection. You have no more genes in common than you do with yourself, 100%. So if you think about putting yourself in other people's shoes, and this is something that all kinds of religions have done for a long time. In Buddhism, they say, imagine every earthworm is your mother, right? And you can say, imagine that non-human animals, reincarnation, I think it's obviously a false idea, but I think it's a very good idea in terms of a technology of increasing empathy towards others. And that's one thing that I think humanism has gotten away from, which I think is great, but I do think that that's one reason why people can be skeptical about people who are non-religious, is because you're taking this kind of moral software that other people have downloaded and you're choosing not to download it because you have other moral software that you prefer to use. Okay, in terms of sentientist ethics, this is the famous ad campaign, why love one and eat the other? And in the same way as I said that we are more morally inclined towards people that exhibit kinship cues, we're also more morally inclined towards agents that seem like they have something in common with us. And we've bred dogs for generations, thousands of years, in order to show us the same kind of facial expressions. If you actually look at a dog's face, they have many more muscles than a wolf does, so that they can make all these different facial expressions at you, so they can elicit your warmth, and they can make you feel like they feel really bad about eating all the biscuits. So dogs have this incredible ability, and pigs don't. Pigs have not been bred to be house pets. Pigs have been bred mostly to be food. And so why love one but eat the other? This is another example of how our emotions are actually getting in the way of us making impartial decisions. It's unlikely that a pig suffers less than a dog would if you were to slaughter him or her to eat him or her, but we feel differently about them because they exhibit different kinds of kinship cues, for example. And similarly, if you look at charity, the amount of money that people spend in various different categories mirrors this, right? The number of animals used and killed in the United States for food is actually something like 9 billion chickens. It's vastly chickens, both in terms of chicken meat and eggs. And yet, if you look at how much money people are spending on non-human animals in the United States, most of it is on farms, and then a lot of people also spend a lot of money to prevent animals being used in laboratories. And the UK has got a very long history of people being against, for example, fox hunting, hare coursing, and also animals in laboratories, when in fact those that is a very much smaller proportion of animals used than animals used on farms. Partly, I think that's because of disgust. It disgusts us more to see an animal used for potentially a medical experiment than it does to see an animal slaughtered so that we can eat them. So this is also a good example of how our moral intuitions are guiding how much money that we spend. Empathy has got many different kinds of failures. I've pointed out a couple of them. We don't really empathize with chickens as much as we do with kittens. We don't empathize with pigs like we do with puppies. And there's also another kind of failure of empathy called scope and sensitivity. And Stalin said, a single death is a tragedy, and a million deaths is a statistic. And in terms of scope and sensitivity, we are much more likely to feel empathy for one person than we are for many people. You really can't feel empathy for more than maybe 2 people at a time. If I ask you how much money you would donate to save a little girl in Africa, you would give me a certain number. And I said, how much would you donate to save 100 little girls like her? It doesn't scale up. People just can't, they don't have the empathetic ability to think about vast quantities of suffering that we have in a global world. And so while many people were really invested in the fate of Nemo, right, there are probably 1 trillion fish killed for food every year, and it's just incredibly difficult to imagine. And I did a study with one of my students where we were looking at what kinds of videos were had the most positive content on them on YouTube in terms of people saying, oh, I really feel for animals now. And people get really heavily invested. If one cow falls off of a slaughter truck and runs through a village, everybody wants that cow to live. Everybody's excited about that cow's life, right? Whereas the only difference between that cow and all the other cows is that somebody didn't secure the door properly. So we are much more likely to feel empathy for one being than we can for many beings. So this idea about us caring about people who are not in our in-group, who are not in our nation, who are non-human animals, and also I'm going to get to even kind of further afield people that we can try to feel empathy and compassion for. And an example of what's called the expanding circle, and Peter Singer has talked about this. He borrowed it from somewhere else, but the expanding circle is this compassion and increasing awareness that we have for suffering of others. And Charles Darwin even talked about the expanding circle. As man gradually advanced in intellectual power, his sympathies became more tender and widely diffused, so as to extend to men of all races, to the imbecile, to the maimed, and on finally to the lower animals. So will the standard of morality rise higher and higher. What he's saying is that you can feel moral sensitivity for more and more people the smarter you get, which is something else that I'm going to be talking about. As man developed their faculties, and in terms of culture, the greater our abstract reasoning, the more kind of sensitivity we can feel for others. So one example of this expanding circle is a movement that I'm involved in, which is called effective altruism. And the idea here is to increase well-being for all sentient beings. That's like people, animals, and future beings. And that's why I call myself sentientist, right? I think that the ability to suffer and feel pain should be the basis for moral appraisal rather than anything else. And these people, rather than trying to use their emotions, they try to use critical thinking, evidence, and open debate. This is why effective altruists often are contrarian as well, because they like to feel themselves having their emotions pulled in divergent directions. They like to think about things that are upsetting, because it might mean that they're coming across something where their rational faculties are going to disagree with their emotional faculties. They like that kind of eureka moment. And also on cause prioritization, so focusing on problems and causes that are global, tractable, and neglected. So talking about how you can actually alleviate suffering the most by putting resources into a given problem, rather than just doing things that feel best for you, rather than necessarily solving problems that are closest to you. Although oftentimes the problems that are closest to you are the ones that you're best able to solve. So I think there is some wisdom in kind of a communitarian spirit. And some major effective altruism causes are, for example, reducing global poverty. So that makes a lot of sense. And in some sense, reducing global poverty also can increase morality. What they found across cultures is that the less pathogen risk people have, the less diseases people have, the more individualistic and less traditional those societies are becoming. Societies are becoming more secular, and people think it's in part because of lack of disease. If you think about disease, disease is going to make you cling to traditions that you have. Disease is going to make you more traditional, because it's very important that you cook food the same way that you always have. It's very important that you engage in the traditions that you had, because it costs less energy and it's less likely to spread disease. This is a very large ongoing bit of research which talks about these problems, about how as people have died less in the developing world, they've actually also become less traditional, more individualistic, more democratic, more egalitarian. Prevent and cure neglected tropical diseases, that's another very important facet. Reduce animal suffering, so one is to boycott meat, but I myself think that everybody's not going to become vegan. I think that making meat that doesn't come from animals is going to be the way forward, and also reducing global existential risks, including artificial intelligence and bioweapons. So I'm going to talk more about that now. What is catastrophic and existential risk, and why is it important? Well, it's very difficult for us to empathize with everyone on the whole globe. And it's also very difficult for us to think about things that have very small probabilities. But there are things that have very small probability that could wipe out all of civilization, that could either kill the vast majority of people, or they could put civilization and humanity back into the dark ages, where humans would no longer be flourishing, where it would be impossible for us to have a gathering like this, for people to be well-fed, for people to have dignity, for people to enjoy life and flourish the way that they are now. And that's incredibly important. And yet it's very difficult to figure out what kinds of things are going to cause these risks, because they seem to have very small probabilities. It's very difficult to think about these kinds of problems. And your emotions are really going to be impossible for you to use for these things. So that's kind of one problem that is very important. And I actually I went to a conference where we were talking about future people, all the future people that could exist. And I didn't really think existential risk was that important at that time. And we did this activity where we looked into a stranger's eyes, and you look into the first stranger's eyes, and then you say, this is a family member, this is someone you care about deeply. You look into a second stranger's eyes, this is somebody who is impoverished, who lives on the other side of the world, who needs your help. And you look into the third person's eyes, and you say, this is a future person. They really want to exist. They really want to be happy. They really want to be in a flourishing society. how are you going to help all these people, right? The people in your community, the people who are struggling on the other side of the world, but also all the future people who really have no voice, and they are just as important as we are. There may be more people in the future than ever existed now, and this is the most kind of contrarian thing I'm going to be talking about today, is how important existential risk and future people are. People for whom we were going to have a lot more difficulty having empathy with. So in terms of, this kind of logic, Nick Bostrom has come up with something called astronomic waste. Even with the most conservative estimate, assuming a biological implementation of all persons, the potential for over 10 trillion potential human beings is lost for every second of postponement of colonization of our supercluster. And what he's saying is that it's very important for us to colonize space. The universe is expanding, and we can have people who have lives worth living, who are happy. And for a utilitarian perspective, whether you agree with it or not, you have to consider, what is the value of a new life versus an existing life? What is the difference between cutting someone's life short and then never bringing a good, happy life into existence? And it's very counterintuitive to think about that way, because we prioritize people who already exist. But the argument here is that we should also consider prioritizing people who do not yet exist. One thing that's contributed to this expanding circle is intelligence, and this has been called the moral Flynn effect. Steve Pinker talks about this in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, as well. And over the course of the last 150 years, for which we have evidence, for which we have IQ tests, it seems like intelligence has increased. And intelligence has increased for a variety of reasons. One reason intelligence has increased is because we don't have diseases that would limit our ability to grow healthy brains. Another reason is that we have this very rich culture full of symbolism. We educate our children. We have adequate nutrition. We have vaccines. All these kinds of things are reasons why we've been able to develop this intelligence. And intelligence is not just good for solving problems and solving IQ tests. It's also good for being able to overcome this kind of elephant, this emotional elephant that wants to take us in directions where we prioritize our family and our in-group over other people, where we don't even manage to think about how a non-human animal could be morally important. And the moral Flynn effect is that essentially over time, as we've gotten smarter, our circle has expanded, our circle of moral concern has expanded. However, this is potentially slowing down. There's reasons why to think that we might actually be at the brink of how much our intelligence can increase. And even though we are smarter than potentially any other generation, I know that's difficult for many people to believe, it turns out that we still are beholden and shackled by these evolved emotions that constrain our moral behavior in a variety of different ways. So one reason why it's really important to talk about morality right now is, well, there's a couple reasons. One reason is that there was this idea that God endowed human beings with morality. We have this divine creator. But we're actually going to be creating beings that can behave and that have psychologies, and we have to endow them with a morality. And what kind of morality are we going to endow them with if we have no idea what our morality should be? Should we stick to our evolved morality, or should we actually overcome our evolved morality and think about things rationally? And one criticism, I'll just mention this as an aside, leveraged at evolutionary psychologists, is that we like the status quo. We want to keep things as they are. We think that men and women should stay in 1950s sex roles, where nothing could be further from the truth. I want to understand human evolutionary psychology so we can surpass it. So we're going to be creating new beings that can behave. And people are already talking about this with self-driving cars. Self-driving car trolley problems. Should a self-driving car kill its driver as opposed to killing a bus full of people? Will people hack into their cars in such a way that they can prioritize their own lives over the lives of others? In addition to that, it's going to be possible, and there's actually a paper by Molly Crockett, who is at Oxford, about how different kinds of serotonin-enhancing drugs, SSRIs, depression drugs, make people behave differently morally, just based on the serotonin in their system. But it will be possible to enhance people's morality. So if our morality has been enhanced just simply by potentially lack of disease, better nutrition, this increase in intelligence, is it also going to be possible to tinker with people in such a way that you can give somebody a drug that makes them more compassionate for others? In Waking Up, Sam Harris talks about trying MDMA and thinking, I care about the welfare of everyone on the planet as much as I care about my own welfare. That only lasts about 6 hours, but it could be a state of being that people could live in, potentially, if we develop those kinds of drugs. Or there could be genetic enhancement. There's CRISPR now. Would you want somebody to get into your genome and help you experience more empathy, help you think about moral problems more rationally? And I think that in order to solve these big problems, this catastrophic risk and this X risk, and thinking about how to save people's lives and how to do the most good, we actually might need moral enhancement. And our aversion to moral enhancement, ironically, comes from the same place as the immorality comes from in the first place, which is the evolutionary psychology that we have. So if you ask people, what would you like to change about yourself? If you could take a drug to change some aspect of yourself, what aspect would you change about yourself? I know this is a bit small. And so what they ask people is, what would you be willing to enhance? People are pretty willing, 50 or 60%, willing to enhance their language ability, their wakefulness. People would like to get less sleep, their concentration, their reflexes, etc. But if you ask people, would you like to enhance your empathy? Would you like to enhance your confidence? Would you like to enhance your motivation? People are much less likely to say they want to enhance those things. People don't want to enhance their morality, if you look here in the lower right-hand corner. So essentially what I'm trying to do in this talk is tell you a little bit where our morality came from, our evolved morality, but also to think about how to integrate our heads and our hearts together, how to be thoughtful about your gut feelings and how you feel. And I think humanists are very interested in human flourishing. They're interested in happiness and the good life, and how to structure society in such a way that people feel fulfilled. And effective altruism is also about trying to improve human flourishing and trying to transcend structures, social structures that have been in place that have held us back, including our evolved morality. Finally, I just want to say thank you for listening. And Sentient Institute is I belong to. You can donate to them. Giving what we can is also really important. And I'm just going to say really quickly, because I forgot to mention it before, there's about 9 billion chickens killed in the US. I don't know how many are killed here. So when people go vegetarian, I was just talking to Andrew about this. When people go vegetarian, they often think it's okay for me to eat chicken and fish, but I should really stop eating pigs and cows because we have greater empathy for them. And as it happens, if you stop eating chicken, eggs, and fish, you can be doing 90% of what a vegan does. So rather than saying stop eating beef and stop eating pork, I would say do the opposite, because chickens and fish are much smaller, and you have to kill many more of them to make a meal. And I just sort of derailed the end of my talk with that, but I thought it was important enough to do that. Thank you so much for listening.